The 8th house, the infamous, scary house where death presides. It is the doorway to Hades, to the underworld. It is the scorpionic house and therefore has very plutonic undertones. The place where the scorpion stings and the arcane substance of transformation first disintegrates and melts one away, so then that the phoenix can be reborn from the ashes, the phoenix being the higher octave of the scorpionic process of transformation, the journey through Scorpio. So esoterically, this house has much to do with discipleship and the purification of the astral plane, of the emotional nature, the meeting of the shadow. Remember, in the 7th house, we had the meeting with the other. Esoterically, the shadow, or psychologically, we could say the shadow, or the anima, the animus, the contrasexual. And then esoterically, the meeting with the dweller on the threshold, the battle, the reconciliation and the meeting of this higher self and its lower self. And then when the scales are tipped, we head into the battle in Scorpio, or in this case in the 8th house, where we then have to deal with the accumulated latent psychic and libidinal forces within the astral plane. That is the intimacy part of the 8th house, following the house of partnership, right? It is the conjunctio, the merging with this other, and then what that process, that this is the sexuality piece here too, the sexuality of the two coming together, and then the way in which that transforms. Of course, if anyone works with the dream, and you work with the symbology of the dream, if you dream of sex, it is always a symbol of something that needs to be transformed. When you're the one that you're having sex with, or is trying to have sex with you in a dream, it's a statement about some psychic force that needs to be brought together to transform, and something else will emerge. So that's the connection here to sexuality. Now, in the exoteric astrological realm, people have criticized this theme of sexuality in the 8th house due to it being somewhat irrelevant, or that's more of a modern twist, where if you're looking at the concrete chart with transits and with the individual, sex and romance you're always going to see in the 5th house, and that is true. But the connection to the 8th house in terms of this evoking some aspect of sexuality is this thing to do with libido and psychic life force, specifically from the psychological angle and the esoteric angle, the latent resources. This is the collective resources piece, the latent resources that are kind of existing in the unconscious, that are waiting for consciousness to penetrate deeply enough to transform. That's again, the sexuality piece is really this alchemical statement here. And lest we forget that Venus, who is often associated with romance, relationships, sexuality, my desires, esoterically is a 5th ray planet and has to do with the union of the opposites on the mental plane. So it's a higher octave of sexuality, which is alchemy. So in the way that the 8th house is psychological and alchemical, therefore it is sexual. So yes, when we're talking about exoteric or exoteric interpretations, romance, relationship, generally we'll see the courtship and dating and sex in that sense in the 5th house. But for people with prominent 8th house placements, there is often a magnetic or a strong sexuality to them, a strong libidinal energy. They're moving with a lot of that magnetic force that comes with all of that material in the astral plane, for better and for worse. In the best case scenario, it's someone who can penetrate and investigate and take on that psychological attitude where one does come to know themselves very intimately through that process of facing the shadow, facing the dweller that we come to meet in that 7th house, facing the shadow and being able to really turn that over and therefore liberate vital energy. And here is the relationship with the 2nd house, its opposite house. We spoke of prana and values, and the way in which one of the exoteric delineations of the 2nd house being gaining material resources, or let's say if a malefic transits, someone robs you and takes something away, that this 8th house is a higher octave of that, again at a broader level or a slightly larger psychic scope. One of the exoteric delineations too is other people's resources, other people's finances, the finances of the partner, that partnership expressed in the 7th house. The 8th house can delineate something about the other person's resources, but at the deeper level, what's the archetypal connection here to all these other themes we've been discussing? When you marry someone, you merge with all of their stuff, for better and for worse. And the most concrete example of that is their actual stuff, finances, resources, etc. So there's the connection to sexuality there. There's the connection to pranic energy. Not surprising to see depth psychologists again with either a prominent Scorpio or some emphasis on the 8th house. One of my favorite music artists who does not just have Pluto and Mars conjunction in the 8th house, but is also a Taurus Capricorn individual. So we've got the dense earth water axes there. Anyway, this was someone who wrote a lot of music about sexuality and even the sound and sexuality, addiction, all of these unconscious motivating psychic forces that can be very destructive. Is the death component destructive when they are not liberated by consciousness? In the 8th labor of Hercules, that's the scorpionic labor, he faces the 9-headed Hydra. And at first he's battling it, and then there's a certain point where there's a realization that it's not something to be battled with, and he bows to it, and he's able to raise the Hydra up into the light. And so, yes, there's a battle that takes place with the shadow, but of course, if for anyone that's worked with the psyche, worked with transformational processes, you see that, yes, there's something that you're initially fighting against, that's the other in the 7th house. But once you get to the core of it, it transforms. And it ceases to be. The tension of the split of consciousness comes to a resolution. And then whatever was hidden in terms of that psychic force, because anything that you don't own in yourself gets pushed into the shadows, for better and for worse. So when we are able to bring that into consciousness, it becomes something else. And so there's this, again, sexuality with the intimacy with the shadow, intimacy with the lesser self, or intimacy just with the unconscious, whatever is in there, and being able to liberate that and reveal a broader scope of resources. One of the concrete expressions, again, 2 people coming together, getting married, and then you have all these other resources that you can work with. It's the same thing. So we can also see here, yes, the 6th house is the house of illness, but we can sometimes see references to chronic illness in the 8th house. And why? Because any kind of pranic psychic life force that isn't liberated is going to be this sort of psychic sucking. It's the vampire in the shadows, or the anima issue, the mother complex, the father complex, or like the hidden golden shadow, because sometimes we suppress and hide the beauty of ourselves, the hidden gift or whatever. If it wasn't safe to express our authentic voice or something like that. Those sorts of things remain stuck and trapped, and all of that becomes resources that are not, it's like baggage rather than a direct flow of psychic energy. So chronic illnesses we can see here too. Not uncommon to see people with, from a more exoteric angle, we can see people that are working with other people's resources in a very literal way. Someone with Sun in the 8th house might be someone who's a sports agent or a talent agent, right, where you're working with other people's literal gifts. So even in that way, because we might say, what's the relationship there between that meaning and money, or that meaning and death? But it's, once again, you're merging with other, in this case, other groups of people or many other people, and you're moving around their psychic energy bags, if you will. It's not the best analogy, but you can kind of pick up what I'm putting down here. It's you're moving broader levels of psychic energy that comes with working with the other, or more than just one other person. Coming back to the negative aspect of this house, if we've got a strong identification here, then we can be identified with whatever that dark shadow is in the depths. I think a serial killer had Sun and maybe a couple other placements in the 8th house. Jeffrey Dahmer, now, he was, for those of you who don't know, a cannibal, and he wanted to make his victims, he wanted to lobotomize them and make them sex slaves. And when he was being interviewed about this, he said that he never felt hatred, that it wasn't hatred or aggressive energies that motivated his killings. It was it was a desire to merge with, but obviously something going on archetypally that's expressing in a very inverted way. I mean, even eating somebody, it's some sort of, that's an alchemical thing, right? If you had a dream where you were eating food or eating another person even, that would be a kind of alchemical notion towards something that needs to be ingested and turned over. So what's brilliant about that as an example, of course, it's horrid and evil and the most concretized negative expression of that, but even in what these crazy people do, there is a kind of intelligence to it when we understand what the psyche is trying to do. It's just expressing in a way that's unconscious, and therefore the shadow and the unliberated psychic energies are playing out in this very, very destructive way. Of course, that takes us to death as a component of the 8th house. Whenever two come together and merge, something changes, and there's the ending. It's the negative part of the shadow will turn over, and that will cease to exist as it was, and it will become something new. Of course, we see concretely, exoterically, some transits to this house or aspects going on in this house will indicate actual death of the partner. I had a transit go over this house not too long ago, and there was an actual death in my family. When I had my progressed lunar return occur in the progressed chart, the moon was in the 8th house, and it was when we were moving into our property here. And the first night we were here, this is a great example on a multiple range of levels, my grandmother, the great mother principle of the moon, actually died the first night here. And what was interesting about our move here was that there was a very deep re-establishment to the relationship with the mother archetype, which was very warped in my feminine lineage through my mother to my grandmother. I've had a lot of dreams about my grandmother and negative aspects of the crone and the feminine shadow and all of this. So actually moving here, there was a connection there, some kind of shamanic, libidinal connection to the actual ancestry in this case, and she actually died the first night we stayed here. And so there we go, that's another 8th house thing. And the connection then to inheritance, because not only was there a liberation of this representative of a psychic force in my case, but when my grandmother passed away, then there was an inheritance that came through. So that's the other people's money and resources again. But symbolically, we would say when something dies, more resources are gained. And in a concrete way, it could be a death in the family, and then you're pulling from those resources. I think the last one I want to touch on before we look at Oken's list is that of the connection to the 8th house and occultism. Now, I actually don't think the 8th house is a true house of occultism. I think it's more a psychological house. And sometimes when we're investigating the taboo shadow energies, that takes us into the hidden mysteries. So it can have this connection to occultism in that way. I think true esoteric study of the ageless wisdom is actually a 9th house topic, which is also the case for astrology, exoterically, or at least in the Hellenistic tradition. It's the 9th house is considered the house of astrology because it's big picture viewing, looking at all the different things. Some people will connect astrology to the 8th house, but really, if it does show up in the 8th house, I would say it's a consequence of the current collective sphere in terms of that which is considered taboo. So that's another key thing to remember as well. We're always interfacing it with our current collective psyche. So whatever is considered hidden or taboo based on the current norms and values of the collective psyche may pop up in the 8th house. So in that way, we could see astrology or occultism there. But I think true, like broader, big picture study is much more of a 9th house subject matter. And I think psychology, depth psychology, is much more of that occulty hint, but more so at that process of transformation. It's the tantric thing of merging with substance and turning it over, and that's another hint to sexuality there. So that's all I have to say about that attribution to occultism. So with that said, let's go to Oken's house list. Okay, number 1, we've got transformation and regeneration as the exoteric meaning and the soul-centered meaning, the path of discipleship. So I guess we sort of touched on that already. I suppose you would just compare that with, let's say, if you have 2 time twins with identical charts and you've got a lot of 8th house placements. One expressing some more psychologically may be a psychologist or someone who studies the human psyche and does all this. And yet for the other person, it may actually indicate a specific metaphysical solar awakening where the process of discipleship begins to take root. So it still has an element of the psychological potency there with this path of discipleship thing, because when you are a disciple, you are working with the scorpionic energies, the scorpionic death, you're astrally processing information, but it takes it to its other octave level up from just someone who is still mostly personality centered, but is on a journey of transformation. So it's like just still both transforming, but one's a bit more carries that metaphysical hint to it, or that flavor, where there's a bit more of that solarization process moving that process of transformation. Okay, 2, sexuality, the vehicle of rebirth into the consciousness of the soul. The two halves come together, the battle takes place, something's regenerated, and there's the emerging solar life. 3, transmutation of values. So similar to the second house here, esoteric delineation, transmutation of personal desires into the wishes and requirements of the group. So selfish consciousness dying, re-emerging as group consciousness, or solar consciousness more generally, right? 4, other people's resources, transformation of personal and material resources into group and spiritual resources, right? So it's a pranic energy thing. 5, death, transformation of dense expressions of energy into more subtle ones. So hinting at what I talked about with the liberating libido, right? 6, desires of the personality, soul-centered, liberation into world service and the victory of the soul. Overall, we're looking at a very potent house here. There's a lot to be said for the way in which regenerative processes take place, the way in which the shadow is confronted, some of the ways that this particular individual looking at the natal horoscope will best achieve that. And really actually a house of service too, because of that collective aspect, that which of the lower aspect of the selfishness, or that which is held separate from the individual as a result of that inability to transform, when it's transformed, becomes all of these resources to then serve. And that would be the financial aspect, or the octave up of the financial aspect of sharing resources or combining resources. When you turn something over in yourself and you really live that human and solar journey of transformation, that becomes the wisdom. And so this is really that expression of facing your own soul and doing whatever it takes to do that. That's why this house is often considered this scary house, because as Jung said, and Jung in his Placidus chart at least has his Jupiter in the 8th house, people will do whatever it takes to avoid their own souls. Why? Because of all the fear, or all the... and transformation is scary. I mean, when you really confront the dark depths, there is so much that can be turned over, and so many changes can take place in the life. But in that way, it is such a meaty house with all of these different processes going on. So if you have a lot of planets in the 8th house, then whether or not there is a great deal of soul contact, there will be this theme of transformation and regeneration most likely taking place. In the worst cases that we see, let's say like a Jeffrey Dahmer type, where you've got all of this energy to regenerate, but because there is a lack of consciousness and a lack of ability to be mediating with the shadow in a therapeutic way, and then it plays out in a bad way, and then it becomes destructive. Scorpio and Pluto, it's an externalization of the destructive power, where rather than giving death to your own complexes or death to your own limitations, it's that projecting out and concretizing it onto the other. It's the same thing with all serial killers. Really, as I mentioned, there is often a logic to how they're going about their evil killing when we look at what are the psychic undertones and what's really going on in the depths. But of course it is an unhealthy way to express it. But coming back to, if you've got someone with a lot of placements here, transformation, self-investigation, and having to really grapple with limits in a very visceral way. And it's the same thing if you've got a lot of Scorpionic placements or Taurus Scorpio axis, and often Cancer Capricorn axis, I would say as well. Earth and water signs often have that theme of the transformation of energies anyway. But there's a great deal of victory, as Oken mentioned, to be experienced with this house in terms of sticking with that process and treading the steps and being able to liberate one's creative capacity and those resources that can become oriented towards world service and the aiding of others.